thought, let me just take a real good look at this data. And so they had like 10 partnerships, or somebody had 3 partners, 4 partnerships, but they weren't always in order. And so you could make the assumption that because the first 2 didn't overlap, that there was no overlap, but the third one actually might overlap with the first one. And so I, besides doing pretty extensive data checks, I also rewrote a program that would compare every partnership with every other partnership. And Ada went through every one of these things manually to make sure there weren't duplication, because there were also apparent duplicate partnerships. You know, partnership listed twice, but looked concurrent. So she did all this coding, review, and I did the coding, and we developed things to display the records and everything. So we published a paper from the National Survey of Family Growth in '95, and then eventually we applied for funding to analyze the 2002 National Survey of Family Growth. And that was the first chance to look at concurrency in men. So we did that. And then we got a grant to look at, it was an interesting experience. We had written the paper in the meantime on contextual factors in concurrency. The idea being that the reason that, I mean, in our earlier work, we found that there was considerably more sexual concurrency among African Americans. And that in the younger adult years, there was concurrency kind of in all the groups, but as you got up in the 20s, the whites would get married, the African Americans not nearly as much, and the concurrency would remain there. And we'd written papers about what we thought was behind this, contextual factors, the education, the unemployment situations, the incarceration history, and various things like that. So we thought we would try to do a study with the 2002 National Survey of Family Growth using the contextual data set, where you can get information about the census characteristics of the neighborhoods that people were in. So that was funded, and we worked on that study for quite a while. It turned out to be very complicated, because to get access to the geographical data, you have to go through the Research Data Center of the National Center for Health Statistics. And there are 2 ways to do that. One is you go to these special offices they've set up where you can be kind of in a clean room, so to speak. You don't get anything out of there, just your final result that they've looked over. Or you can do remote submission. And we've opted for the remote submission, but it turned out to be a nightmare in some ways. So it took a lot longer than it might have. And in the end, one of the things we found was that we couldn't control for race. Because when you looked at the sex ratio, there was no overlap to speak of between the sex ratios for the whites and the sex ratios for the African. There was overlap, but very little. Because the white sex ratios, what we also realized was that it was really hard to interpret the sex ratios that were intermediate. So we decided to look at balanced sex ratios, meaning 1.05 to 0.95 men to women, versus low sex ratios, so below 0.9 men to women. And when you looked at those, there was almost no overlap between whites and blacks. And there was much, much more concurrency with the low sex ratios. So in a sense, we could have done this study without the geographical data at all by just using, I mean, we could have found that that overlap wasn't there by just using the census data on sex ratios. But anyway, but we were able to control for things, and so which you couldn't do in the census data. And then Ada and Jane Brown in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and Joan Cates in the Journalism and Mass Communications, and I worked on a proposal to do a mass media intervention targeted at African Americans in rural eastern North Carolina to try to make their attitudes less favorable to sexual concurrency. Or not make them, but to lead them to be less favorable. So she had identified a marketing company in Pennsylvania to develop really kind of edgy ads that would get people's attention and kind of jolt them a little bit. And so we had these dramatizations. There were several dramatizations. At one scene in a barber shop where these 3 guys are talking about their relationships and things, and one of them's got an STD, and he's, oh, you know, whose fault is that? And you shouldn't feel bad about it. You know, this is what men are supposed to do. And the other guy says, no, man, that's crazy. And so you know, these scenarios, which I'm not portraying well. And we collected telephone survey data, 2 independent samples a year apart approximately, to see if there was a change. And it does seem that the attitudes have been changing more negatively about concurrency. We're writing that one up now. So yeah, the research has been interesting. It's been wonderful working with Ada. Wonderful, because she is much better of a manager than I am, and I don't have to be a manager. And she's been extremely appreciative, and she's a terrific writer, but I've been able to add a little bit to her writing, and she's been great for that. She's, I mean, it's just been a wonderful collaboration for 20 years now.
So can you say a little bit more about your involvement with minority health? Like I know you've been very involved with the Minority Health Conference. Maybe say a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, in the late, so when I got involved in that NC Mutual study, that was kind of my introduction to minority health, because I really didn't know much about it before then. And I went on some site visits to the different NC Mutual offices and talked to some sales agents, and I realized, you know, we're talking smoking cessation because that's what we think is most important. That's because we have our funding for it. But these people have issues that they go well away from that, beyond that, and the huge disparity in economic resources is just so powerful. I mean, here's NC Mutual. It was the largest black managed life insurance company in the country, and there were, I think, 2 photocopiers in the company. You had to get permission to make photocopies. Buying a printer for the computer was a big deal. They just didn't have, you know, like I'd been in insurance companies years ago in, you know, New York City, whatever, you know, not even the big insurance companies. So it was a totally different world economically. And then you find out that the ratio of wealth is 10 to 1. You know, you hear about the salary discrepancy. Oh, well, it's 70%. Well, that's like women to men. You know, that's not so bad. You get the wealth discrepancy, 10 to 1. And it's bigger than that since the economic recession. So when the NCI came out with an RFA for cancer control in minorities, minority cancer control, it was a supplement for cancer centers that they could apply for. And Barbara Hulka heard about this and asked me if I would lead writing a proposal to do it. And I really didn't want to, because I didn't want to write a proposal and I was trying to finish up the NC Mutual study or whatever, but she was very persuasive. And she pointed out that some people I knew needed funding, and this could provide them with funding, and well, okay. And so I went ahead working on this, and the idea we decided to do was to have 4 sub-projects in this, make it like a mini program project. And the cap was $75,000, but I'd been told by Joe Cullen that if it was good enough, we could even ask for $150,000. So we wrote a thing for $150,000, 4 studies. David Strogatz, I think, had a study in it. Russ Harris had a study as part of it. Sandra Hedden in Health Behavior had a study in it. And Paul Godley had a study. And he actually wrote part of the overall grant, too. He did a great job on it. He wrote the significance section, in fact, because he knew about cancer, I didn't. So we submitted this, and it got a very high score, and it got funded. The only problem was that they said, you know, you asked for more than the amount. You can't do that. And I said, well, you know, we had a conversation with Joe Cullen, and he said it was okay to do that. And they said, well, you got to show us some documentation. And this was, I think I must have had an email or some kind of communication, something in writing, that I could provide. Or maybe they just said, maybe it was something or other. And so we got in touch with Joe Cullen, and he said, yes, that's right. I was able to give him whatever he needed to be reminded. And so we got the $150,000, while other people who got funded got $75,000. We're guilty about that, but we needed it to what we wanted to do. And so we had this program project. And one of the things that I'd written into this was that we would work with the Minority Health Conference to help develop the school's minority involvement. And I went down to Bill Small, and I said, we've got this money, it's great, but the conference hadn't occurred for 2 years. Because, you know, it was run by students, and the students turn over, and
it falls apart.
That, you know, I mean, it just happened that for a year or 2 there weren't students who were ready to take it on. So Bill said, well, we got to do something about this. So he convened the students and got a committee going, and we planned a Minority Health Conference, and I had some money now to put into it, and my wife had worked for the Office of Continuing Ed, so I knew about them, and they'd never really been involved in this conference before. And I said to Bill, you know, maybe the dean would ask the Office of Continuing Ed to work with us and help support it. And he did, and the dean's office said yes. So we now had professional involvement in helping to plan this. And Bill also talked to the dean, and he was willing to put in, you know, like $5,000. So we had some money, we had this professional assistance, and Bill was there leading, you know, organizing. I mean, you know, convening the students. Actually, they led it. They've always led it. People give me a lot of credit for it. You know, your Minority Health Conference. That's ridiculous. It's the students who put this on year after year. But you know, we planned 2 days, and the second day was going to be on the Minority Cancer Control Research Program. So we had, 4 of our people presenting about their studies and various things like that. It was very successful. Biggest one, I think that they'd had it filled up, Rosenau Auditorium. The problem was parking. Of course, there's nowhere to park. So we did that, and then next year we again did the same thing with another minority cancer control research program involvement, a panel, I think. And that came off very well. It was big. They had an overflow room, I think, for the first time, with the audio and video maybe being put into another room, and maybe 2 rooms. It was, and finally, a few years later, they decided that it had to go to the Friday Center. It had to leave the school because, for one thing, there was still no parking, and it was really outgrowing the school. So I guess it was mid-90s. It moved out to the Friday Center, and then it started to fill the Friday Center, and it's just been terrific. And in I guess it was 1998. So when I worked with Dot on that project called Project RAP, Reaching Adolescents, Parents, and Peers, which was this middle school project, she was also working on a project with Trudy Bennett and Lloyd Edwards to create a minority health project, they called it, which was taking advantage of an RFA from the National Center for Health Statistics, was going to develop a course on minority health research and do some things to make research data more available and research publications more available. This was the pre-Medline era. And then there was, and then we had the Minority Cancer Control Research Program. That may have been the 3rd pillar. The idea is there were going to be these 3 pillars, and those were going to be brought together to build a minority health and research education center in the school. And that's kind of a long topic I won't get into now, though I've written a little bit about it on the web. And we had a committee that Dot chaired and so on and so forth. So this minority health project started conducting these conferences once a year. They'd have this 5-day course, morning and afternoon, bringing in outside experts. It was really fascinating. I went to the first one. I may have gone to more than one in the school with about 60 people. And then in 1997, some money came down from Washington, some leftover money or something. They said, why don't you broadcast the afternoon sessions? And so this company came down from Washington. OJ's mother-in-law, I think, OJ McGee, who was the video production person in the school, the manager of instruction, his mother-in-law, I think, had this company. And so they came down, he was working for the company, came down, and they broadcast from Rosenau Auditorium the afternoon sessions. And it was the first experience with doing that kind of a thing. It was satellite, it was pre-internet, really. I mean, the internet was there, but it didn't do that sort of stuff. But we had satellite, C-band, satellite, or HU-band, or what, KU-band, I think it was at the time. And so we had several hundred people on this, and that was quite a bit bigger. So the next year, Lloyd Edwards was the PI then, and he said, we ought to do this from the May Center. So the next year, we did it from the May Center, and we had a smaller number of people there, but it was a bigger audience. And then in, I guess it was 98, he came to me and said he was going over to Duke. Lloyd got an appointment at Duke, and so who would take over the Minority Health Project? And we didn't succeed in finding a new director, and he said to me, Vic, why don't you do it? I said, me? I'm the wrong person to do this. He said, no, you do it, you can do it. So I agreed to do it, and I got a nice note from Dean Bill Roper saying, thank you for doing this. So I was thinking about how to do this, and there was salary support that came with it at the time, so David Savitt said, this really won't do anything for you here, but it's a nice thing of you to do. So I took over the Minority Health Project, and partly with that, I began to think, video, this broadcasting, we could be doing this with the Minority Health Conference keynote, and give it some national exposure, because it was, although it's a national conference, you don't get many people coming from outside North Carolina. And so the student organizers were wary about it because they didn't want to lose their audience. They were afraid, well, gee, if people can watch this thing online, they're not, or on broadcast, they're not going to come. And now the internet broadcasting was becoming a possibility. So the first time or 2 times it was done as an internet broadcast, and we were real careful that it wouldn't take people away, but it didn't take people away. Their conference kept getting bigger. And then one year, they got some money from the state. The health director gave us some money to do satellite broadcasting. So with only like 3 weeks notice that the money would be available, we managed to get, 60 satellite sites or something like that, plus the internet. So that was in 2000 and, I'm going to guess 2001. but I could be wrong about the year, but I think it was 2001. And so that became then a regular part of the conference. And I was working with the conference each year, and I was particularly involved in the broadcast, because that was an area I knew something about. And there was a while when I had staff through the Minority Health Project, at least a part-time research assistant student, and that person would work with it and so on. But over the years, the conference has brought the broadcast more within its organization. They have their own broadcast committee. Originally, I was a member of it, and an important part. I kind of led it in the beginning, but then I was a member of it. And now I don't think they invite me to. I wasn't even invited to meetings in the last couple of years. They've done a splendid job. And then about 7 years ago, I guess it was, I was at APHA at the School of Public Health alumni reception, and I was chatting with. Oh goodness, I've got his name in my head, but it's quite there. But anyway, I was chatting with one of the past chairs of the conference. And I said, you know, we have this broadcast. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could get organizations at other schools, like student organizations, to have their own event on the same day as the conference and be part of the annual Minority Health Conference? So you could start next year and be in the 30th Annual Minority Health Conference. Mm-hmm. And they'd have the broadcast of the keynote as part of their conference, and they could have other stuff too. So there was one of our alumni, so he thought that might be an interesting idea. So we talked about it with some folks, and gee, I wish I had written these names down beforehand. I didn't think about doing that. But I think it was Teresa, anyway, was one of our graduates who is now at University of Illinois Chicago. And she thought it sounded like a good idea, and she talked to their students. They had an organization, Minority Students for the Advancement of Public Health, and they liked the idea, so they planned the conference, and they really liked the idea, and their administration was very supportive. So they planned out a full dress conference with their own keynote, plus the one broadcast from Chapel Hill, and other sessions, and posters, and a free lunch. And they did this, and they got over almost 200 people, over 200 people there the first time. Mm-hmm. And they didn't all watch the broadcast, but most of them did. Mm-hmm. So we also had 5 others, I think. There was Tulane University was in it. UCLA may have been in it. Berkeley, I think, was in it. Blocking on which ones were in that first one. But it's all online. I've tried to put all this stuff online, so there's like this history is preserved, and mm-hmm. I'm hoping to figure out some way to preserve it beyond me. Mm-hmm. So that was quite an exciting affair. And so these partner conferences have been an annual part of the conference. And I take some credit for being an initiator of that and helping to promote it all the time, because of course the students turn over every year, so they don't remember. You don't have this institutional memory as much, and the connections and stuff. Mm-hmm. And of course those students turn over too. So UIC has done it every year since then. Mm-hmm. They had their 7th, I think, this year. And they've had hundreds of theirs. They've been quite big. George Washington University started the year later with one of our alumni there. And so that's gone on now for 6 years. Harvard's done it several years. Tulane was back again this year. They did it for a few years and then paused, and now they're back. UCLA did it a few years. And then other organizations, non-student organizations, have also had partner conferences. And this is in addition to group viewings. So like health departments and other places will have a projector and show the broadcast to a group of people there. But it's not a partner conference because they don't have other stuff of their own. Right. So we don't call it a partner conference. Right. So that's been my involvement with the Minority Health Conference. Wow. It's been very rewarding. Mm-hmm. It's just been wonderful to work with folks.
Sounds like it. So we're about out of time, but is there anything else?
Well, we probably had a time a while ago.
You wanted to add that was important? What's come to mind?
Well, you know, it's been such a privilege to be here. Mm-hmm. It really has been. You heard a little bit of my background. You didn't even get a lot of the unconventional background I have for getting into epidemiology. I mean, it was so bizarre mm-hmm. that I was accepted into this department, given my background. Mm-hmm. And you know, if you said, what kind of research do you want to do? I didn't know. I didn't even know I wanted to do research. I must have said I did. And my life in the department has been such a blessing. It's been so charmed because of the terrific support I've had from my colleagues, the chairs of the department, the students. Just been wonderful to work with. I just feel extremely fortunate. I'm going to start phased retirement in July, and that's 3 years, and then after that, I don't know. But I just feel so remarkably fortunate to have had this lifetime here.
Well, great. Well, thank you for talking.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be interviewed. And of course, it's been wonderful to work with you. You were a star TA back in FE 168.
You remember?
I do remember.
I guess I should say my name for posterity. Amy Sayle, here
right.
from 93 to 98.
Thank you. Good. And also the date. Today is
March 13th, Friday the 13th.
Is that right?
2015.
2015. Thank you. But I remember you did FE 600. You did FE 168 for a whole semester. But before that, I think you also did a few guest appearances as a TA.
I think so. That sounds familiar. I think I counted up at one point. I was a TA for 8 or 9 times while I was here at grad school, which is probably why I work in education now.
Well, you're a terrific teacher.
Thank you.
Are you still at the planetarium? And you're teaching about astronomy?
Yep. I just took a group of 100+ people on a trip through the universe this afternoon.
So I should let you see some of these videos by John Hagelin.
Okay.
About the universe. John Hagelin is a string theory physicist who discovered TM and is now one of the leading people in the TM movement. He actually ran for president on the Natural Law Party. They created a political party one year to get some visibility. But he has this remarkable, I mean, he explains from the Big Bang to the present. And you know, when you think about it, of course, we are fundamentally energy, these tiny particles, quarks, electrons, and protons, and whatever it is. And you build those up into atoms and molecules, and then the molecules form into macromolecules, and they form into tiny groups of cells, unicellular, multicellular creatures, and work your way up to people. At what time, where does it stop being the atoms interacting and the quarks? It doesn't, of course. It's always, I mean, we are actually assemblages, mostly empty space, but assemblages of these tiny particles based on energy or whatever interacting. And that's the reality, even though we don't think of that as the reality. But you've got, what is it, 86 billion neurons in your head, approximately?
Don't ask me to count.
I think it's something like that. And I've got 86 billion neurons in my head. And our neurons are interacting. It's not only going, I mean, you know, you have multiple neurons looking out and multiple neurons going in. And so this interaction is much more complex than we give it credit for, than we realize. And then you think of how many people there are, these trillions and trillions of neurons and interconnections, because of course each of these neurons has like thousands of interconnections with each other. So it's this incredibly complex thing. And that's what's underlying the reality that we're trying to work with through incredible simplifications, oversimplifications really, even though we're successful with them. We managed to accomplish a great deal, but it's through these incredible oversimplifications of a very complex reality. And so a lot of things that we dismiss out of hand, or oh, this couldn't be, like, you know, in the TM movement they talk about levitation, which a lot of people think, oh, that's crazy. I couldn't believe it. When I was on the TM teacher training course, is when it was the time that Maharishi came out with these, what he calls the cities, these supernormal abilities, or these advanced techniques that you can develop supernormal abilities, like levitation. And people aren't really levitating. But they are hopping. And it's an interesting phenomenon, because people go up, and they're not jumping in the usual way. I've seen enough of it and experienced something like that enough to know that it's not the same as saying, now if I want to jump, I can show you how I can jump, and I couldn't jump that way anyway. But so there's something going on that is not within our familiar everyday experience.
I'm wondering how that would have gone over if you brought that up in that orientation day when you're introducing yourself.
That was one of the reasons that I didn't try to do research on TM.
Really? Because you didn't think people would accept it?
Well, it was one thing to talk about stress, and we can show the reduction of stress, and there was good laboratory data that showed the things. And I went to see Sherman James, who was on the faculty, and he was very helpful to me throughout my career here. But early on, when I first came here, I went to see Sherman to tell him about TM. And I walked into his office, and we were talking, and I said, so I'm talking about TM. He says, oh, TM, oh, the Maharishi. I saw him on television. He was talking about levitation. And I realized it was going to make it very hard to write grant proposals and things like that, to study stress reduction or stress release 3TM, when people were going to say, oh, but this is about levitation. This is crazy. And I didn't know what to make of it for years. But I did take the course, and I watched people around me lifting off the phone. And I don't have an explanation for it. There are physical explanations. I mean, this is not a violation of laws of nature. They make that very clear. But our understanding of laws of nature is very partial. And John Hagelin has an explanation in the laws of nature of how this can actually happen. So, since you're knowledgeable about astronomy, I'll try to remember to send you a link to one of these videos.
All right.
I'll be interested to hear what you think of it.
Okay. With that,
so we need to close this off.
We'll close it off.